Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Today, we are presenting our palliative care education series session entitled Resilience, Grief, Trauma, and Self-Care in Palliative Care. I want to draw your attention to our palliative care website, which I'm hoping you are familiar with. This is our new website where you can come to register for all of our sessions. This is where you will join all of the sessions, and this is where you will also see any archived sessions that we have going on. This is our homepage here where you'll see the most recent upcoming session. And then if you click on education series or workshop series, you'll see our next upcoming and also our archived sessions. As well, we have a resource page on here that has quite a few different palliative care resources specific to COVID, as well as additional resources and websites that you might find useful. And when you arrive here, if you do require a certificate of attendance, you can obtain that by clicking on this link in the front here to sign in. Submit your attendance, and it will automatically send you a certificate. At the end of the session, you would also come here to complete your evaluation. There's a link right here. So everything can be found on one website. You can also register through our registration page for all upcoming series rounds or workshops as well. This page will remember your options. So if you come back, you can change them, and all your information should still be there. If you have any questions throughout today's presentation, you can push them through the chat box to me, and they will be forwarded to our moderator, who will present them during the Q&A session. And with that, I do believe that I will hand it over to Madeline to introduce our presenter for the day.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. I'm Madeline. I'm a former registered nurse on an oncology unit, and now I'm a second-year medical student at NOSM on the East Campus. And this year, I'm the student rep on the Palliative Care Program Planning Committee at NOSM, so I'm excited to be moderating this session today. And I'd like to now introduce our speaker, Mr. Eugene Dufour, for this morning's workshop. Eugene's been working in bereavement, trauma work, hospice palliative care, and the HIV and AIDS movement for the past 30 years in a great variety of roles. He's an individual, marital, and family therapist. He's a bereavement specialist, a compassion fatigue educator, an author, and he's also a critical incident stress debriefing consultant with a bachelor's degree and master's from King's College at the University of Western Ontario. Eugene's been a champion for palliative care across the nation for several years, and he served as president of both the Ontario Palliative Care Association and the Canadian Hospice Palliative Care Association. In recognition of his work in hospice palliative care, Eugene was presented with the commemorative medal for Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth's II Golden Jubilee in 2002, and he was also named a Paul Harris Fellow in 2019 for his involvement in establishing the Rotary Hospice of Stratford Perth. He's also written a book for caregivers titled Embracing the End of Life, which provides a lot of practical tools and guidance to ensure that the end of life is a time that's dignified and comfortable for those who are receiving palliative care. Today, Eugene continues his dedication to providing excellent support to those involved in palliative care as a psychosocial spiritual care clinician with the Huron Perth Palliative Care Outreach Team. I'm really looking forward to this workshop, and I'll hand it over to Eugene now.
Thank you very much. Whenever I hear an introduction like that, it sounds like I can't hold down a job. So first of all, I just wanted to acknowledge I work mostly in Huron County and Perth County, and those are the traditional territories of the Anishinaabeg, Iroquois, Ojibwe, and Chippewa people. And I participated in a presentation by CAM8 on nutrition in the residential schools, and it just again opened up my eyes to the incredible abuse that happened to our First Nations brothers and sisters, and they explained that the acknowledgement of these sacred lands is one, to acknowledge the sacred lands and to be committed to, reading the Truth and Reconciliation report and to keep pushing for some justice in that particular area. They did that workshop on the day of the orange shirt, and that's the first time I heard of it. And I thought, wow, this is a new endeavor. And then I realized the orange shirt, excuse me, has been around since 2003. I did my BA in the 70s and the master's in the 80s. Many of these courses were in social justice, and I not once was made aware of the plight of our First Nations brothers and sisters. And so that's just been really helpful for me to be aware of. I've lived a privileged life. I'm male, I'm white. I had the opportunity and the privilege to go to university. I've never known unemployment. I've never known poverty, and I've never known war. And so just that whole aspect has been opening up my eyes on dealing with this particular experience. So I just wanted to share a bit about resiliency, grief, trauma, and self-care and palliative care in light of COVID-19. So I've done about 60 debriefings with long-term care facilities throughout Ontario and 4 in Quebec that were English speaking around the trauma of how this hit long-term care and the staff. And I know many of you will have patients who are long-term care workers, and just being aware of the complicated grief that's coming down the road. Long-term care, as we know, is an organization that's already been really hit with inadequate funding, shorting of staff, and this just complicated it. So when the pandemic hit, about 30% of long-term care staff resigned, and for really good reasons. They had small children, or that they had partners or kids that were immunocompromised, and they just had to protect their families. And so now that they're starting to come back, the ones that were left were feeling very abandoned. The ones that are coming back are feeling extremely guilty. Add that on to the second wave. And I think this is what is going to be that whole particular trauma that we're going to see. And, the bottom line is we were just not prepared for this level of suffering. And so I'm going to be addressing a lot of that word suffering because, we're in a culture that says don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. And for God's sakes, don't share about suffering. And once we step into people's suffering, that's what makes it really helpful in dealing with this aspect. And we never know where people are coming from. So this was Sarah. I was working at a long-term care facility. She was 96 years of age, nonverbal, and continuously screamed out. So the nursing staff asked, could you just go in and try and quiet her down? And I did everything. The soft voice of mine did lots of talking, which didn't work. I even tried singing, which made it even worse. And I noticed a tear going down Sarah's cheek. And so I thought, and it just kind of stayed there. And I thought, oh, that must be uncomfortable. So I just went and wiped it off with my hand, and she stopped screaming. So I waited, and about 8 minutes, she started screaming again. And then I just gently caressed her cheek. And I did that for about an hour. And I had no idea what it was doing, why it was doing it, but it worked. So then we got together about 15 volunteers, did a little training program, and we each took 2-hour shifts sitting by her bedside for about 18 hours a day, just gently caressing her cheek. Every 10 minutes, every 8 minutes, if you waited 10, she would start to scream. And so 8 minutes, I don't know what that was about, but it was just a real powerful experience that we did for about 6 months. Her 3 sisters were coming over from Europe. Sarah left a war-torn country to come to Canada, and she was on her own. Her sisters were coming to say goodbye. Sarah had end-stage heart disease and was probably going to die within the next couple of weeks. So when the sisters arrived, again, they were in their mid to late 80s. They were well enough to make the trip. And I told them about this little thing that we were doing. And they started laughing. They said, oh, we know exactly what that's about. And they told the story about their war-torn country, when the soldiers would come in during the day, Sarah would protect her sisters by putting manure on their faces so that the soldiers wouldn't touch them. And at the end of the day, she would wash off the manure on their faces and she would tell funny, funny stories. And that's what they remember. They remember the funny stories. They don't remember the manure on their face. And then I said, oh, well, who washed off Sarah's manure? And then there was that very, very painful silence. Oh, she didn't put on manure to make sure she drew the attention of the soldiers as another way of protecting us. You know, we never know the stories that people carry as we walk with them. And that's just always been just such a great reminder to me of before I go into a room or into an office or a patient's home, I say to myself, so what am I here to learn? And what could be sort of the mystery that's going on here that makes it really helpful in dealing with that aspect? I love this quote by Joan Borisenko. We in the care partnerings community frequently encounter people with life-threatening illness at a point when they are no longer who they have been and are not yet reborn into who they will be. We meet them in a place between no longer and not yet. That is very difficult for the clients that we walk with and very difficult for ourselves. And that's what also, you know, majority of this presentation is to look at us as care providers and the cost of caring that we do, so that as we are between that period of no longer and no yet, not yet, we can still provide excellent compassionate care to the people we walk with, to our colleagues and to ourselves in dealing with that aspect. Again, this has been a very powerful experience. I do a lot of debriefings for fire departments and police departments, and I got a call to do a debriefing for a particular fire department. And this car, what had happened is someone had stolen the stop sign on a Friday night. And a Saturday morning, a mom and her daughter were driving through, and they went through the stop sign because it wasn't there, and they were hit broadside and thrown into this cornfield. And it was a 50-year-old woman that was driving, and about a 26-year-old woman was in the passenger seat. And so they pulled the one in the passenger seat out here, and they noticed that she had her vital signs were absent. It was a young firefighter who had just started and had been on the force about 3 months. He unbuttoned her blouse and started to do CPR, and that's when he noticed breast pads, that she was a nursing mom. And he looked into the back seat and he saw a car seat. So he said to his colleagues, there may be a baby in here. And so as he continued to CPR, it was a mother-daughter. And the mother, when it was 50, she woke up and said, yes, she has an 8-month-old at home. We were on our way shopping. The baby's with the dad. And so Air Orange landed, got her to University Hospital, and she died en route. So I was doing the debriefing to this fire department. So I get there, and there's about 20 firefighters and this guy's wife sitting beside him. And she says, I'm not leaving until you tell them what you're doing. And what he was doing is he was getting up early in the morning and going out to the cornfield to so-called look for the baby. And the fire chief heard that, so, okay, to the hospital. I said, well, just wait a minute. Can you just tell me a bit more about the story? And so he talked a bit about it. And what we found out is that he had a 3-month-old at home. And that's when he learned about breast pads. He wouldn't have had a clue what a breast pad was before that. And what he was doing is he was going, not really walking into the cornfield, but he was going, just driving beside and just thinking about, how am I going to protect my family? How am I going to carry on doing this work when this, incident happens, which can happen so easily? And he was just suffering about the future. And so I said, now, is there any of you guys that I kind of work the same shift with him that could go with him? So what they would do is they would meet at the Tim Hortons, have a coffee, and drive out to the cornfield. It was usually around 2 or 3 in the morning. And then the second time they had a coffee and they went out at 10 o'clock at night. And then the third time they just stayed at Tim Hortons. So I share that story to say, It's the meaning and purpose behind the trauma. It's the meaning and purpose behind the suffering to get to. And that's why, as we go out of sort of our fix it mode and step into the suffering with them first, that's what's going to allow them to reveal that whole particular suffering that they're doing in dealing with that aspect. So the word care is a Latin word, which is cara, which means lament, to grieve, to experience sorrow, to cry out with. It's an invitation to enter into someone else's pain before doing something about it. You know, that's probably my biggest struggle. For 35 years, I still jump into doing mode. And it's the power of our presence that's most important, of them really understanding that we understand their suffering and are willing to step into that. And that's where caring is a partnership, where one person reveals their pain, brokenness, and vulnerability to another. And it's through a relationship of trust they work towards healing and wholeness. Now, healing and wholeness is really important. Healthcare, for the most part, is in the business of curing, but in hospice palliative care, we're in the business of healing, which means to make someone feel whole. And that allows us to go into so many different avenues that can be really helpful. Parker Palmer's a wonderful educator, spent most of his time teaching teachers, but he says this: one of the hardest things we must do sometimes is to be present to another person's pain without trying to fix it, to simply stand respectfully at the edge of that person's mystery and misery. Wholeness does not mean perfection, it means embracing brokenness as an integral part of life. And that's where I truly believe you folks here are wonderful caregivers, but you're much more than that. You're healers, allowing people to feel whole, and willing to step into their misery and then listen to the mystery behind it. So, mystery is such again, our culture does not embrace mystery. And it's by stepping into people's misery and looking at what is the mystery behind it. They or us may never find it out, but knowing that they got a companion, that's what makes it really helpful. So it's always important for me to remember, in hospice palliative care, we witness great woundedness, great suffering, but we're also part of a great healing of making people feel whole in dealing with that particular aspect. Pema Chodron is a Buddhist priest, and she has this beautiful retreat center in Halifax. I did an 8-day silent retreat there, and they get you up at 4 o'clock in the morning to do an hour of meditation. And when I saw that on the schedule, I said, nope, not me. I love my sleep. I'm not getting up at 4. And those little monks, they are very determined to get you up, and they did. And I was amazed at what I discovered in that hour of meditation. And it's got something to do with the meridians, body lines of chakras. But it changed my work in working with bereaved people, especially bereaved parents, because often they come into my office and say, 4 o'clock in the morning, I wake up, and I'm just thinking about my child. And often it's a lot about ruminating about what they could have done differently or better. And I often look in the chart, if I know they're taking a sleeping medication, I say, well, why don't you break that in half and take one at night and take the other at 4 o'clock in the morning, completely unaware about what was happening. And now I tell them to set your timer on your phone for 45 minutes and just do, just think of what you need to think about your child. And it's just really changed the way they've done grief work. So I love this quote: the truth you believe and cling to makes you unavailable to hear anything new. I've always got these blinders on, and I'm constantly looking at the truth that I believe in, and is it holding me back? Or is it embracing some of the stuff that I need to do in dealing with that? And, in the world of therapy, and I'm sure in primary care, we have a saying that the clients we need find us. And that's where, the more that our practices can be ways of self-reflection, that's what makes it really helpful in dealing with this aspect. So what we've discovered with COVID-19 and complicated grief is a number of things. People being isolated from loved ones before death, the main focus in the second wave is how can we allow people to be with their loved ones at the time of death? That they saw the incredible damage that it did to families and to caregivers, and to the individual that was dying, and how difficult that was. We had a gentleman who was had bone cancer. His palliative care performance scale would have been about 60, so he still had, 6 or 7 really good quality months left, but he slipped and broke his hip, and so he went to UH to get his hip pinned, and he just deteriorated really badly and was dying in ICU. And his wife was the only one allowed in ICU, and his 4 kids were in the parking lot. The wife had an iPhone, the kids had Androids. FaceTime would not work. So they called me saying, "What can we do?" And I said, "Is there somebody walking in the parking lot? Ask somebody if they've got an iPhone." And there was a nurse coming off shift. She said, "Yeah, I have an iPhone." So I gave the mother her phone number. She handed the phone over to the kids. And for 40 minutes, she, social distance, but supported them as they said goodbye to their dad over the phone. I mean, it was the best that we could do, but how devastating it was that they couldn't be there. So that not being physically present during the last 48 hours is very difficult. The ability to practice deathbed rituals, especially in our long-term care facilities and in our hospices, they've developed these beautiful rituals of forming honor guards, of putting quilts over the person's body, bringing them right to the vehicle, and now the gurney is pushed in the lobby. There's a body bag on top of it. They can't put their cloth bag on. They can't do any of their rituals, and they have to push the body outside of the lobby without having that being able to accompany them. And the nursing homes that I've talked to said, "We're not doing that anymore. We're going to find a way to do this respectfully." And they were devastated by that in dealing with that particular aspect. Witnessing personal suffering from a distance, and that's where it leads to helplessness. And then the restraints of time, or the restraints of supplies, any kind of restraint, that really leads to hopelessness. And that's what we know about suffering, is that it really connects to helplessness and hopelessness. So if we can address those 2 issues, that makes it really helpful. Individual, family, cultural, social, and faith-bound rituals were very hampered, if not eliminated. And that led to a lot of postponed grief, that the death happened. They're going to do a memorial service down the road once COVID restrictions are lifted. And so it just leaves people kind of feeling empty and just frozen in a lot of their grief. So with ourselves, witnessing mass suffering adds to that traumatic nature. I have a colleague in Italy, and she was giving me so much more information about what was going on. She was in 2 of the hot zones, and she was saying, they didn't tell this, but there was 104 physicians died during that time. There was over 80 nurses died, and 130 priests and nuns that had died, because most of the priests and nuns were retired, and that's what their ministry was, going to hospitals. And they're a culture that really doesn't trust politicians, so they weren't listening to what was coming down. Why the spread happened so drastically. And so that mass amount of suffering, to the point where I had to say, okay, we're not there yet, and I can't hear this anymore. That was really difficult. So that mass suffering is something. And then grieving without my people. What we know is grief freezes us, and the more that we can reach out to people, the more helpful it is. And when you don't have that, that makes it really difficult in dealing with that. So the pandemic just has a bunch of these losses that are really important in dealing with that particular aspect. The loss of endings, biggest thing of not being able to say goodbye well in dealing with that particular aspect. So I will make sure that Sarah gets this. I had the night off last night, so I updated some slides. I never give a presenter a couple hours before a presentation because they'll add to it. So I'll make sure Sarah gets this updated one and post it on the website, send it to you directly, email, or on the front is my email address. Send it to me and I'll give you an electronic copy of it. It's important. So that leads to suffering. And so witnessing other people's suffering, there's two aspects of, first of all, knowing ourselves and seeing the suffering in other people. So these are the two things that I know I don't feel so overwhelmed when I focus on the two things. And it's our human connectedness that really attracts the suffering. So I can go into the wilderness of the soul with them, but I'm not responsible to find the way out. And that is so freeing around that, so that you can recognize their suffering, you can understand the mystery and the misery that they're going through around that whole aspect. And so that just allows us, once we reflect on that, to really respond to other people's suffering. So that, active listening for around meaning and purpose is so important in dealing with that particular aspect. So again, there's that two circles that are happening, and it's kind of reminds me of barbed wire. And that's a really good image, because those little things that stick out, they hook you, they catch you, and they hurt around that. So the one is that desire for our clients to escape the suffering and the enduring from the suffering. So just being aware of that, recognizing it, and that there's a whole bunch of emotional suppression, which takes energy. So if you walk with suffering, to have that emotional release, it makes it more helpful in dealing with that, where they're trying to escape for suffering, but knowing that they're supported, they're able to look into it in dealing with that aspect. And probably the biggest thing I needed to learn was to forget my time-bound assumptions. So in grief, the culture says you got 3 days to get over grief and you should be back to normal. It just doesn't work that way. The latest research out is the death of a loved one takes between 2 to 3 years to get over the initial impact, and the death of a child between 5. When I say that, families breathe a sigh of relief, because they say it's been 4 years since Johnny has died, and I still feel like I'm going crazy. So much of our job is just to normalize their grief that they're dealing with, and not necessarily having the answers, which is important. I worked with this family where their 17-year-old had died, and it was the year anniversary, and they still hadn't picked up the urn at the funeral home. They didn't know what to do with it. They were still so emotionally distraught. But the major thing was they were feeling so guilty of not going up to it and getting it. So I got permission from them. I said, can I call the funeral home and let them ask how long they can keep it? And they said, sure. So I called the funeral home and asked about it. And I said, oh, yeah. And please tell them that we have a special vault that we keep the urn in. All the information is in the computer, and it's also stored in another jurisdiction. So if case our computers get destroyed, everything is good. But we invested in a very good fireproof safe that these will not get destroyed. And I said, oh, good, that'll be really helpful. And they said, they can take as long as they want. It can be 5, 10 years. That doesn't matter to us. So before I hung up, I said, Wayne, by the way, how many other urns do you have there? And he goes, 46. So when I told the family that, it just, again, normalized it, took away the shame. They're not the only one. This is a hard thing. And you're not really leaving that there. You're respecting the process to say, we want to find a really good way of bringing the urn back to wherever it will be in dealing with that particular aspect. So when it comes to moral suffering, or when it comes to witnessing suffering, it leads to a lot of moral distress, moral uncertainty, and moral dilemma. So let me use a simple example of when we switched from doing face-to-face sessions to virtual. I am a people person. My greatest skill set is this chubby little baby face. I've got this soft voice. I really work hard at physically being present. So when somebody's talking, I know exactly when to lean in a bit and when to lean in a little closer. And I got robbed of all of that. So it led to, that whole moral dilemma of what I was doing and how am I going to change? The moral uncertainty, is this going to work? And then just the moral distress that I feel completely useless. So this is just a simple example of how that, and I can remember our Lynn just allowed us to do phone consultations. We couldn't do Zoom or FaceTime or WebEx yet. And after about 2 weeks, I noticed people saying, "Are you there? Are you there?" And I'm thinking, "Yeah, I'm here. I'm nodding. I'm leaning in," realizing that I need to be much more alive in the sessions and much more responsive that I would been in a session and dealing with that particular aspect. So it's important to know about this discomfort, that it's just not moral distress, but that uncertainty and the dilemma that it has around that. Most of us didn't have to struggle with decisions around a ventilator or no ventilator, where they did in New York City and in Italy. That was their biggest, a lot of post-traumatic stress in Italy and New York City amongst care providers, mainly because of choosing who gets the ventilator and who doesn't, of dealing with that particular aspect. So the results of that moral distress are, just when you think about if a system, a medical system, a family system has done you harm, there's that lack of trust. There's that a lot of avoidance behavior, just a lot of regrets, and then that vulnerability to future moral distress. As we talked about the second wave, I just remember just being in complete denial that, oh, we're going to get bypassed. Our Southwestern Ontario, we were pretty lucky. The hospital system didn't really get overwhelmed. And one of the key learnings was there is, we always heard about how the healthcare system, especially the hospital system, is so slow to change. Our hospitals in our area went down to, they eliminated 80% of their occupancy within a week. It can change if it wants to. And that's probably been the benefit of the pandemic, is it's really torn down silos. And, the change that happened, we had Ontario Health created, the elimination of the LHINs. We were just about, to start off with the Ontario Health teams. And then the pandemic hit, which really forced us to work together a lot quicker in dealing with a particular aspect. So it's just good to be aware of down the road of the people that might be coming in, especially if they're long-term care workers or first responders. And when I say first responders, I mean you folks too. Anybody in primary care, tertiary care, where you're seeing patients for the first time, you're first responders. Our medical office assistants, our ward clerks, housekeeping and food nutritional services that go into people's room, they're all first responders. So we have to be really aware of the complicated grief, often known as chronic, traumatic, prolonged, complex, or difficult grief. I really like to use the word difficult grief because it's so much easier to work with than, let's say, traumatic grief around that. So it's really important never to use the word pathological grief or a disorder. I heard one author talk about post-traumatic stress disorder as post-traumatic stress reorder. And that's her whole philosophy, is how do you reorder this experience instead of being stuck in with it as a disorder in dealing with that. I throw this slide up just if you ever want to get some really good information. The Center of Complicated Grief has excellent information. Plus, they periodically put on some really good workshops, all focused on complicated grief. And their definition of grief is excellent. It's the response to loss that contains thoughts, behaviors, emotions, and physiological change. If the loss is permanent, so too is the grief. I just love that phrase because, we live in a time-limited culture and a ruler culture. Gee, so-and-so is doing much better and they've been only bereaved for 3 months. I'm 6 months and I'm doing much worse in dealing with that particular aspect. And then again, just their definition of complicated grief, that it's just so much dominates life and how to focus on that. So I love the word maladaptive. I'm not thrilled on the word dysfunctional. Um, I was so lucky. My first lecture in hospice palliative care was with Dr. Larry Liebrecht in Toronto. And he said, just remember, and that was back when the word dysfunctional was really popular. He said, always remember that people's dysfunction is their function. And that took all the judgment out of it. And I saw families in a different light. Instead of focusing on as their dysfunction, it's their function, and try and get to understand that. And that was really helpful in dealing with that aspect. So as you know, Dr. Liebrecht developed pancreatic cancer. He diagnosed himself before he was medically diagnosed. And there's, if you Google it on YouTube, he did 2 or 3 YouTubes on the process of his dying, which were so powerful in dealing with that particular aspect. So what we know about unresolved or complicated grief, again, unresolved is a great word. It just puts so much power that you have the ability to resolve it. So it's that absent grief that I'm seeing a lot of, not being able to be present for the death rituals and just doing important around that particular aspect. And Sarah, also send me a message if I'm talking too fast. I got a tendency to do that. So just type in slow down, and I will. Delayed grief. I presented before the pandemic to the Canadian Funeral Directors Association, and that's what they're experiencing is death happens and a memorial service down the road, which often doesn't happen. So that's really important, that delayed grief. The inhibited grief of I just don't have the energy to grieve this are important in dealing with that aspect of it. So there's so many components of unresolved, complicated grief that we will be seeing. So just a little bit of compassion fatigue. And if you ever get a chance, Francois Matayo, she is the compassion fatigue specialist. I think her organization is called TEND, T-E-N-D. She's from Kingston. If you just Google her name, resources. And this is what she says. She first quotes Figley in his description of compassion fatigue has been described as the cost of caring for others in emotional and physical pain. It is, and this are her words, it is characterized by deep physical and emotional exhaustion and a pronounced change in the helper's ability to feel empathy for their patients, their loved ones, and their coworkers. It's marked by increased cynicism at work, a loss of enjoyment in our career, and eventually can transform into depression, secondary traumatic stress, and stress-related illness. Now, this is the most important part of the sentence. The most insidious aspect of compassion fatigue is that it attacks the very core of what brought us into this work, our empathy and our compassion for others. That's why compassion fatigue is so important for us to be aware of in dealing with this particular aspect. So here are some of the warning signs that we all know about. And I always focus in on staff, but whenever I review them, I go, oh, I need to pay attention to this one. Oh, I need to pay attention to this one. The most important thing about compassion fatigue is the one on the bottom left, disruption to worldview. And that's what does the most damage and has the most long lingering effects around that. So we all have a worldview of how it is to operate. And when we experience compassion fatigue, it tears that apart. And that, as a result, really gets to the core of our being. And that makes it really difficult in dealing with that particular aspect. So along with that burnout is Christine Maslach has this wonderful book, and it's called The Cost of Caring. She goes, burnout is the index of dislocation. Again, I love that word, between what people are and what they have to do. It represents an erosion in values, dignity, spirit, and will, erosion of the human soul. Now, the human soul, well, we get really scared of that word, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, because I think once we kind of break it down and look at different ways of viewing it, it's really workable around that. So what we know is that, there's that burnout creation of all the things that can really affect us. So I know part of burnout for us is the breakdown of our community. I always could go into an office where I had nurses, nurse practitioners, support staff that I could talk to. That was really helpful in dealing with that. So making sure that we have that particular sense of community. So I know a group of us get together once a week virtually and just review a journal article. Can't be no more than a page, and just what's one of the most important points of that. And that weekly contact has been really helpful in dealing with this aspect. This is a really great slide because, it talks about rust out and burnout. And then there's another phrase that I would love to put in. It's called brownout. So in medical terms, a brownout is when they decrease the electricity to the whole province or a whole area so that everybody's got an electricity, but it's going to take longer to cook. Your lights aren't going to be as bright, and it's actually harder on your appliances. But this way, it's a way of being fair instead of having blackouts all over the place. We really need to be aware of brownouts when the work that we do draws down some of our energy, because what we do is we do that for a long time, and it can have just as a bunch of negative effect that it can have as burnout and dealing with that. So rust out is that, when there's very minimal challenges, that there's that period where you're in your comfort zone. And this is the area that we do the most. I do the most learning is when there's that bit of a stretch where there's really challenging family situations. And when I stay out of judgment and really work with the family, I just can learn so much that can be so helpful. It's when we get into that strain, and at time of COVID, there was that strain because, I thought I do a lot of driving around to people's homes. I'm going to have all this free time. And next thing you know, it's 7 o'clock at night. I've talked to about 12 people, had 12 sessions on the phone, and I haven't done any charting yet. So I set the timer on my stove. So when it goes off at 6 o'clock, I physically have to get up and shut it off. Which tells me you got to leave your desk. So that was, kind of that thing. The strain was helpful, but this is what's really important: the zone of where we get so disillusioned of the suffering that we see is that's really important. So this is a real helpful slide to look at. So I just want to talk about if you go to psychotherapycenter.com, this author describes, and he talks about two different types of stress. So routine stress, that's, usually 0 to 6 is really what we all deal with. You can function with it. And there's that traumatic stress, which is higher on the scale, which is the 7 or 8 in dealing with that. So he uses a container to describe it. So you have your stress level limit, and then the stress goes in there. So whether your capacity for containing stress is small, medium, or large, everyone has their limits. And we're all a bit different on how people deal with stress in dealing with that other aspect. So traumatic stress is often too intense to handle, and we then kind of put it to the bottom. It settles there, and it often stays there at a 7 or 10, dealing with that aspect. So then we compartmentalize it for long-term storage, and it just remains there, and it doesn't heal, and it kind of festers. So I rarely have dreams. My dad died about a year and a half ago, and I took the compassionate care leave program for 8 months to be with him, and it was one of the best experiences. He lives in Windsor, so it's a 3-hour drive. So I just moved there for the 8 months, and I do palliative care much differently now. I do a lot less talking and a lot more listening. And it was just an incredible experience and so much gifts that he gave me. But I had this dream, and it was about a memory, a real life experience. We had about 30 years ago, a car accident where a mom and a 4-year-old daughter were hit broadside and were pushed into this field of sunflowers. And the 4-year-old died. She had snapped her neck, so there wasn't a scratch on her. And there's this beautiful blonde-haired little cutie. It just wanted to shake her and just say, okay, you can wake up now. And it was a new pediatrician. It was her first death notification at the hospital. She had kids the same age. I had kids the same age. And we still, 30 years later, when we talk about it, can still hear that mother's scream. Um, and so we were all, after the families left, and we were just sitting in the trauma room, just supporting each other. And that's how that experience ended. So 30 years later, I have a dream about it. Last Sunday, I was sitting in there in that room with everybody, and my dad walks up to me. I stand up, he gives me a hug, and we walk out. And that was very, very significant because my dad wanted me to be a life insurance agent because his life insurance agent made a lot of money. He had a very wonderful life. And my dad just hated seeing me doing so much on call and being witness to so much suffering around that. So the hug was very, very significant about that. But the other thing was that for 30 years, I've been carrying that incident around and needed to again debrief it. That was really important in dealing with that aspect. So the bottom of our stress bucket is we need to be aware of. So with routine stress, with enough time, it usually can evaporate. I know myself, if I don't do my 30-minute walk a day, I'm a lot more tired at the end of the day. I have much better energy, and it helps evaporate some of that routine stress. But again, the reminder is that traumatic stress is still at the bottom of dealing with that aspect. But we also know that too much, too soon of routine stress kind of spills over the container and it's overwhelming. And here's the important part is that it leads to panic, which feels traumatic. And it's usually the routine stress when it gets too much leads us to deal with the traumatic stress. So when I mean traumatic stress, I just think of, 5 or 6 of the most experiences that you've had. Sure, we've all moved on and we still continue. It's part of our work, but there is the cost to seeing this kind of suffering in dealing with that particular aspect. So he says there's 2 options. There's boosting coping capacity. So by maybe increasing to a 60-minute walk a day instead of 30, or doing it twice a day might be helpful. So boosting capacity, but also speed up the offloading of stress. That can be really helpful. Plus dealing with some of the traumatic stress. So that's where whenever there's an incident, I always have a colleague that I say, do you got 5 minutes, which can be really helpful. And later on, I show that example of a way of doing a quick debrief around that. So this is, again, an important aspect of secondary trauma. It's because of the complex relationships. We have our work environment, we have our client environment, and then our personal environment. So already you got 3 different avenues of gaining routine stress and or traumatic stress. And what the answer is compassion fatigue. So the compassion fatigue task, this is what's the clinical term of it. But if you just Google compassion fatigue test, it will come up. There's no cost to it. I was doing it once a month. I'm now doing it every week. It takes about 20 minutes. And what it tells you is your compassion fatigue, your compassion satisfaction, and your burnout. So it highlights the 2 kind of negatives, but it also talks about your compassion satisfaction, which is really helpful. And it's not that we're weak by some of the traumas we are experiencing. It's the exposure. If you have exposure, it doesn't matter the container. And we're so hard about being critical of the container. I'm a professional. I've been trained for that. It shouldn't bother me. The fact that we have kind of is what's really important. So I love the sponge analogy. So if you take a sponge and you sit it in water over a 2 or 3 week period, it loses its ability to absorb the water. And so that's a really good point for me to constantly remember, is that I often have to get the sponge and squeeze it out. So by talking to my colleagues of not pushing it down, of really making a point and being intentional about that. And then secondly, getting out of the water. So I didn't get a chance to take holidays. I attached it to a couple of days to long weekends, and I'm now realizing that was a really dumb move. I really should have stepped out of the water for a couple of weeks to rejuvenate in dealing with that particular aspect. So just those 4 quadrants of self-care. So, during a really difficult session, just, being aware of, I'm not here to save the world. I'm going to focus on, instead of just giving some bad news, of just being present, being aware of my breath, being aware of my posture, that whole important of dealing with that aspect so that we really can step into their misery and just waiting for the mystery to happen. And the mystery might be months down the road around that aspect. And so that later, the later ongoing, so by the end of the day, just making sure that you get a chance to sort of get it from here to here, out here, so you can reprocess it around that aspect. So I really love this point. Right after the transition from trauma or the transition from work. So when I'm working in Stratford, I live in Bayfield, which is just outside of Godridge. So it's about a 50-minute drive, is about halfway. So as soon as I see the sign, "Welcome to Mitchell," I'm done thinking about work. They've works had me for another 30 minutes as I think about what I'm going to do the next day. And then as soon as I hit that Mitchell sign, I put in a CD. It's either John Denver or the Doobie Brothers, depends what mood I'm in. And then that just allows me to spend the next 30 minutes not thinking about work. As I get to my house, to the door, there's this big old maple tree, and I just give it a gentle whack on the tree, and I put everybody, everything, every issue on the tree with a commitment that I'll pick it up in the morning on my way back to work. So I'm doing my due diligence. I'm going to make sure I get back to it. I'm not denying the pain and suffering I witnessed, but I need a break. And my family needs me and I need me. So those transitions are really important. Ever since the pandemic, as soon as I get up, I dress up in work clothes. And then at 6 o'clock, I change. So I don't work in my pajamas. Some people find that really helpful, but that kind of transition from my office at home to my home was really important in dealing with that aspect. So this is the website that you can get her information on. And so she talks about low impact debriefing, and it's a really great way of doing it. And this, you start with an awareness of how and when you want to debrief. So, for example, I always do my phone calls here. I made a point of not doing it on the card so that I have all my information in front of me. I had to go pick up a prescription, which is about 30 minutes away because I'm in a kind of a rural area. And my appointment was a gentleman that I had known really well. He's really stable. We're good. So as I'm driving there, I'm on the phone with him and he's telling me he's had enough. He's thinking of self-harm. And he's pretty close. And I just felt so overwhelmed because I didn't have my second phone with me. I didn't have his contact information of people. I didn't have an address where to contact if I had to call the police. So I just turned around and drove to his house, which was about 45 minutes. I needed to debrief right away about that. That was really important. So the next step is how much detail you share when you debrief. At what point are those details vicariously traumatizing to someone else? And how essential are they to the story? How central are they to being able to talk about and how the event story affects you? So if you think I've told 3 stories, the one about Sarah, the one about the cornfield, and then that family with the urn. Just think about that. I purposely didn't give you any warning so that we could go back and say, gee, I wish he would have given, a trauma alert or something like that. That's what's important in this low impact breathing is if you need to get into some detail, you need to say that. So you say to the listener, know that there is a difficult story that you would like to tell. And then you ask permission, like, do you got some energy to deal with that? So we now have a routine amongst our team that, I need a chance to just talk about a particular situation. I usually put it out to 3 people of choice to see if they have. So this low impact breathing debriefing, I think, is really important. It's something that we need to do that can be helpful. Ellen Wolfont's companioning, I just throw this up here because spend some time looking at it. It's just really helpful. And our job is about being present in another person's pain. It's not about fixing it. So going into the wilderness of the soul, it's not about being responsible to find a way out. It's about honoring, listening, bearing witness, walking alongside, sacred silence. The more that's why I think God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth. The more that we can listen, the more help. And that sacred silence, I wait when there's that pregnant pause, as long as it takes for the person, because I'm just respecting that sacred silence. And then again, the more that we can be lifelong learning, and learning from others is so important. And I love that last one, compassionate curiosity, not expertise of getting that kind of information. So we talk about resiliency. We just need to be aware of it's a long-term plan. It's just you just don't build up resiliency within a day. It's about being connected to your vision, your mission, and your purpose in life. Making sure you've got some really good collaboration, both social contacts, support levels are important. Dealing with that aspect, and making sure that we're really providing that compassionate care to ourselves in dealing with that aspect, which often then leads to that tenacity, being persistent. Realistically, the definition of resilience is to bounce back, to be able to bounce back in dealing with that aspect. So these I find really helpful for me to remember, is that on the outside circles of having good social connection, doing those walkings are important. It doesn't have to be a running of a marathon. A good brisk walk is just as invigorating and builds up, the endorphins as much. And just being aware emotionally about where I'm at. And then that mindfulness, and I'll talk a bit more about mindfulness. But then the inner circles of making sure I have contact, good physical care, sleep, and then having that attitude of gratitude around that. I was saying to somebody, I haven't noticed the leaves to be so red. Is it just me this year? And people I've talked to said, oh no, I remember it as being as vibrant. I'm thinking it's because of the blanket of COVID-19 that it is just highlighting these colors. And that just makes sense. So being aware and intentional about making sure that we have gratitude in our lives. So this is, I used to live in St. Mary's, a bridge, a train trestle that they sold to the town, and they made a walkway above it. And there's a bench just to the left of it that I often sit there and I say to myself, what are the pillars supporting me in my life? And that's always helpful. About 4 times a year, I go back to that bench and just sit there and do some reflecting. We are people that need to reflect, and how important that is in dealing with that aspect. So sometimes when you're feeling really stuck emotionally, there's a way of reprocessing it. So the opposite of repression is expression around that. If you can't name it, you can't tame it. So that's really helpful. So the first step is just recognizing. The challenge is to recognize the emotion and feel it in your body. So what am I feeling? And if I'm having a hard time, if it was a color, what would it be? If it was a storm, what kind of storm? All those things are really helpful. And then responding. So just that self-expression. What do I need to do with this emotion? Do I need to talk to somebody about it and dealing with that? And then the third step is that reset of really caring. And I find it helpful for me to change my shoulds to could. Should is guided by guilt. Could is guided by power. Oh, I should do the dishes. Or I could do the dishes. Or I could read that chapter that I've been just dying to read all day. That can be really helpful in dealing with that. So Tara Brach has this RAIN acronym. Recognize what's going on, allow the experience to be. And that's where, again, being a people of reflection, having just set aside some time to do that, and then investigate with interest and care, not judgment. If I've made an error with somebody, I look at it upon what's the learning experience. And then again, just nurturing a lot with self-compassion. So again, the goals of mindfulness and grief, and I throw this in because I think we need to just be mindful of the physical symptoms of grief that we may have, that our clients, the calm mind helps to regulate those emotions that are really important, and that making meaning. So meaning and purpose are the two words that I really focus in. And it just really allows me to rewrite my self-narrative, my own story. Is it correct? And is it accurate? And do I need to make some changes in dealing with that? This is a tool that I find really helpful when I'm really struggling, when someone's really, client of mine that's really struggling, let's say with I will say, may I be a container for your suffering? May I be a container for your son? And the intention has to be there that you will be the container. I find it also really helpful when people are feeling hopeless and helpless. May I be the container for your help? And I purposely chose hands that are bumped and bruised and scratched and dirtied, because I think it's our woundedness that allows us to be really good healers. So it's in that spirit of holding some of their suffering can be a really good tool around that. You know, we've heard so much about mind, body, soul, and this is just one I wanted to throw in for you to reflect around that, because I want to talk a bit about spirituality, because often they say, oh, that's the realm of spiritual care providers, clergy, and actually all of us need to take a role in this that can be really helpful. So whenever I say to somebody, how are you coping spiritually? They often say to me, oh, I don't go to church. I'll say, well, that really doesn't, it's not what I mean. So how I describe it is spirit comes from the Latin word, means breath. And soul comes from an old Greek word, which refers to vital breath. And its translation is shal. So it's a very, very rich piece of slate that's at the bottom of the ocean. So your spirituality is the vital breath that comes from deep within you. So that's what I mean when I talk about spirituality. And when I say that description, boy, do we ever get into some great conversations, how important it is. I remember working with a firefighter who had bone cancer. He wanted to die at home. I think he had about 15 pathological fractures. So pain issue was a real problem. I think he had, was on the highest dose of a pain pump that you could back then. And he loved the French River. Anytime he could go, that's where we'd go, to the French River. And his background was he was raised Roman Catholic, and at age 16, he left the church, and his parents were very, very angry that he didn't embrace the Catholic faith, and it stayed as an issue for the longest time. And there was a lot of guilt on his part. So when I went in to visit him in his room, all his firefighting buddies had taken pictures of the French River and they blew it up, and they had him on its ceiling and the wall. Every inch of his room was covered with the picture of the French River. And I walked in and I said, oh, this is your chapel. And he just burst into tears. And he realized that I didn't abandon my family's faith. I incorporated it into my love of nature. And whenever I was there, it wasn't just for the fishing. I felt closer to God. I felt closer to my family. I felt closer to my pain and suffering. And he was even able to explain that to his parents, and it was just a huge healing aspect. So I love this quote: the soul is the truth of who we are. So I think it's really important that we all ask people how they're coping spiritually, and be prepared to share your own vital breath of how important that is in dealing with that aspect. Because at the time of a crisis, spiritual care, so let's change that word to your vital breath, is to devote presence, attention, respectful assistance to helping people to discern what is the meaning in their life now in this new environment of pain, and how they seek to live out that meaning as the recovery unfolds. So presence, attention, respectful assistance, these are the gifts that you folks have. And it's that allows us to really pass on the medical knowledge, the scientific knowledge, the other tools of our trade that are important in dealing with that particular aspect. So your vital breath seeks connection through belief systems, relationships, to something beyond or greater than oneself to find meaning and purpose. So that's what I go in. Into a room, I got this kind of tattooed in the back of my eyelids: belief systems, relationships, meaning and purpose, and how important that is in dealing with that particular aspect. Just want to touch a bit about emotional regulation. So there's the fight and flight, freeze. I like this. They throw in the word face, and that it's about, engaging and attracting, stepping into the pain and suffering that can be really helpful in dealing with that particular aspect. So this is what I wanted to focus on, was the window of tolerance. So I photocopy this and give this to all the clients that I work with. So it's important that I stay in my comfort zone. I'm feeling emotionally regulated. I have that ability to self-soothe, and that ability to be in that regulated emotional state. Now, when I go into fight or flight response, that's when I'm stepping out of that, and it leads to all those things pink that are making me chaotic and feeling that way. Same with the freeze response or the fade response, is that when I fall into that, I'm feeling very disconnected. And what really helps us stay into our window of tolerance is mindfulness. Deep breathing and mindfulness really allows me to stay that focus. That can be really helpful. And so when I share that with clients, this is one of the most important tools. And it comes from CBT and DBT tools, again, that can be really helpful to us folks in palliative care. The more work I do about CBT and DBT, I see how it applies to my personal life, my work in palliative care. That can be really helpful in dealing with this aspect. So this is the one that I photocopy off because it's easy to read and it's got pictures of what to do. So it's called square breathing or 4-4 breathing. This is what the Navy SEALs and Canadian Special Forces do before they go do their crazy shoot 'em up rescue people. It's their 4-4 breathing. And if you notice on any of the shows when they are going into a place, it's 4 steps and stop, 4 steps and stop, because it's matched to their breathing. That's really helpful in dealing with that particular aspect. So you breathe into the count of 4 through your nose, you hold, count of 4, you breathe out, and you purse your lips. It's the repression of the breath that also is helpful. And then you hold for 4 seconds. So a really great tool that can be helpful in dealing with that particular aspect. I had a chance to go to 9/11 2 days after it had happened to do some debriefing. And any organization that was there had to have a debrief before they left. So I debriefed the Ohio State dog team. They just came back from China to help out with an earthquake. And they were there for a couple of days and realized there was nothing they can do. So they were going to be deployed back home. So I did a debriefing with them. And so they come in, there's 8 of them with their dogs. And I said, before we start the debrief, I'm just wondering, how do you guys cope with all of this? And they said, well, we cope the same way our dogs do. I said, well, how's that? They said, well, after we've been on the site for a couple of hours, we put the dogs back in the van where there's no windows. And then we dig a hole in the rubble and we get one of the construction workers or firefighters to get in the hole. We've got this tarp that looks like rubble. We put the tarp over the firefighter, and then we put enough rubble on it where the person's a bit uncomfortable, but they can still breathe. And then we set the dogs free. Because if the dogs don't experience success, every 2 hours they become despondent, they lose focus, and they become depressed. And what a great lesson that was for me. They spend that kind of attention to your dogs. We need to do that to themselves. And they said, that's our exact point. So that even though, a little under 4,000 people were killed here, we're looking for remains that's going to bring some closure to them. And that's our success. And that's what keeps us in this work. And that's what allows us to train to go back to China or to go to Uruguay or to go wherever we're called to, is looking for the successes in life and knowing that there's the 8 of us that share that burden is really important in dealing with that particular aspect. So that's where, sharing our woundedness. Sam Keen wrote the book Fire in Our Belly. We all leave childhood with wounds. In time, we may transform our liabilities into gifts. The faults that pockmark the psyche may become the source of a man or woman's beauty. The injuries we have suffered invite us to assume the most human of all vocations, to heal ourselves and others, to make people whole, both for ourselves and others. So it's our woundedness. As long as we've done our work on it, that it's not going to interfere in an intrusive way, but it's going to connect with people and know that we've been through suffering is really helpful. So Henry Nouwen has written a book called The Wounded Healer. And what I like is that last sentence: when our wounds cease to be a source of shame and become a source of healing, we have become wounded healers. I know I'm sounding like a broken record. You folks are much more than cures, you're healers. And stepping into that role is what allows us to provide that excellent and compassionate care. So presence, attention, respectful assistance in this new meaning of pain is what's so crucial. Last story. So I went to Vancouver to run a children's hospice, and part of my job was to go to golf tournaments and receive ridiculously large checks. They were Vancouver and BC really supported this quite well. So this one particular course I went to, a guy came up and I recognized him right away. He said I could share this story, but I can't tell you his name. So I'm going to make sure it doesn't slip out. He had just retired. He spent his whole season with the BC Lions. And he said, if there's anything I can do with the hospice, let me know. So he gave me a card and I went back to the hospice and I threw it at my desk. About 3 weeks later, we had a young boy, 14, who came to the hospice for end-of-life care. He needed to take 2 planes and a ferry to get to Vancouver. That's how isolated they were. He had end-stage stomach cancer. There's apartments above Canuck Place where the family could stay because his was pain control was a big issue. So end-of-life care was going to happen at the hospice. So I walk in to introduce myself, and his room is covered with BC Lion posters and jerseys. Huge fans of the BC Lions, but because they lived so remotely, they'd never been to a game or had never met a BC Lion football player. Oh, I got an idea. So I didn't tell him. I go find the card. I call the guy, tell him the story, and there's this pregnant pause at the end. He said, I was thinking of running a golf tournament. Like, I don't think I can talk to a kid that's dying. I said, look, just come and talk about football to do. And if it gets uncomfortable, I promise I'll get you out of there. I promise. So he agreed. He was going to come that following Tuesday morning at 11. And I was going to meet him in the parking lot. So I didn't tell the parents at all, or the little guy. So I meet him in the parking lot. He gets out of his car empty-handed. He had no jersey or autographed football, empty-handed. So I thought. So I bring him into the room. And the little guy is just bouncing off his bed. Of course, they knew him, who he was. And the little guy knew how to use our conference call system. So he called 4 of his buddies back home. You'll never guess who's in my room. Say something, say something. So they had, this huge talk about football. He had won 2 Grey Cups, and they kept on talking about that. And then the little boy said, the hardest thing about dying is not playing football. And that's the first time he used the word dying, because the family were really kind of hiding it from him. And this was the first time. Everybody's eyes went to the ground. And I'm about to yank the football player out of the room. And what does he do? He slips off his Grey Cup ring and he gives it to the little boy. He says, when the pain gets too hard, I just want you to squeeze that ring as hard as you can. And when you get scared and when you feel lonely, you just squeeze that ring. and know that everybody's here to support you. And when you're done with the ring, just get it back to me and I'll give it back, and to give it to your mom and dad, and they'll give it back to me. We all have Grey Cup rings. Some of them are bright and shiny on our hands, and some of them are in bottom of drawers, bottom of pockets or purses, bumped and scraped. Some are real shiny and full display, but we all got Grey Cup rings. And the cost of caring is slipping off those Grey Cup rings. And you folks do this day in and day out in your work and in your home and in your community. And as long as we're aware of the cost of that caring, continue to slip off those Grey Cup rings and give them to people as they focus on pain and suffering and a loss of meaning in their lives. And it's by slipping off our Grey Cup rings that we really do acknowledge the misery, but we support the mystery. That I have no idea Grey Cup ring is going to do for you, but I'm willing to share that with you as we walk in this journey together to provide excellent and compassionate care. I've talked too much. Let's open it up for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Eugene. That was really incredible. And I think even just listening, I feel affirmed in, all the things that I've been feeling about COVID myself, really normalizing that. And that was fantastic. So thank you so much.
Welcome.
So we do have a few questions, kind of across the board. So the first one being, you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that someone needs to get to the bottom of the meaning of their suffering. When it's cumulative, like with a healthcare provider, for example, over many years, or non-specific, is it best to try and compartmentalize that grief or suffering, or to treat it as a whole? And how would these approaches differ in your practice?
Oh boy, that's an excellent question. And I really struggle with that. So what I do is I really follow the lead of the client. So they're going to tell me which way is it. If it's to deal it accumulatively, they may say, oh, that's too overwhelming. I need to deal it in small little chunks. So one of the biggest tools I use is the loss history graph. So you just draw a line and you have them plot their losses. And so they write down their birth date, and then the longer the line up, the more significant the loss. So it's a wonderful graph to see, oh, these are all, and then you get a full picture of what the losses are. So I really turn it to the client, and then really be aware of my agenda. So if I'm really comfortable at a cumulative grief and not on issue grief, that's going to be an inherent a distractor to the therapeutic process. So as soon as they kind of declare, that's the approach I take, and to say, okay, thinking accumulative, but they want to go this way. So being aware of to shift gears around that. So a lot of times they don't know what the right avenue is. And so I'll say, well, let's do one loss at a time and see how that fits. Sometimes the overarching loss is too overwhelming around that. I did 20 webinar series for Hospice Palliative Care Ontario and Canadian Hospice Palliative Care Association. And the feedback I got is, we're not trauma therapists, but often an old trauma will come up, and we can't refer them to do trauma work. They've only got a few months to live. How we do it. So we're going to do a 5-part webinar series in November on how frontline people can deal with that trauma. And they don't necessarily have to tell the story, because that could re-traumatize them. So that would be a good place to start, because we're going to do on trauma-informed care so that we don't re-traumatize. But you bring up a really good question about the two distinctions, and the fact that you named it so well. That's really important, because there are two different ways of approaching it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's good to know that you may have to change gears, I guess, to make sure that you approach it correctly. Our next question is, our clinical workplaces are the classroom for NOSM learners who witness suffering. There may or may not be recognition of this, and debriefing may or may not happen. What would you advise, first, learners on how to ensure their safety, and second, to faculty to shift our culture to a culture of compassion and caring?
So we all need to be aware of our own trauma history and how that might get triggered. So that is so important to be aware of around that particular aspect. And I think, I'll give you an example of a veteran, 96 years of age. He lied about his age in England to get to the war. He was 16. Once they found out he was 16, they said, oh, we're not putting you up at the front line. We're going to just get you to drive ammunition to the front line. And he was only there 3 weeks. He was dropped off the ammunition and the mortars were starting to fall. And he was running back to his truck and a mortar hit. And it severed the main artery in his leg. Another soldier came by, put the finger in the dike, got him to a field hospital, and he had severed that major artery, and he survived. He also sustained quite a few other injuries, so the war for him was over. And he felt horribly guilty about having to leave the war after 3 weeks. If he would have been there longer, not as many of his comrades would have died. And he needed to talk about this trauma before he died. But he didn't want to talk about it. So that was really difficult. So I brought in some stones and I said, I would like to hold some of your trauma. And is there anybody else? So he picked out 5 stones and he picked out 5 individuals, myself, the home care nurse, the care manager, and 2 neighbors. And we got the 2 neighbors over the next day, along with the other 3 of us. And he gave us these stones to carry his trauma. And while he kind of explored it, and what came out was he wasn't running to the car alone, to his truck alone. He was running with a friend that the mortar, and he was no longer there. And his wife said, "You never told me about that." And he decided to die in hospital. And when I went to visit him in hospital, he took out his hearing aids and he said, "I don't want to talk about the trauma anymore. So I'm going to make sure you don't talk about it because I'm taking my ear hearing aids out. I just want to say thank you." So I think there's a role for ritual. So I got about 30 of these in my car. It's just a little jar of stones. And I call them wisdom stones. So I give them to our clients and I say, could you put all their wisdom, love, and affection in these stones? And when you're ready, hand them out to your loved ones. And some do it as a group, some do it individually, where, John, I'd like to give you this stone because this is what's so important in our relationship. Those little rituals are so powerful and beautiful in dealing with that particular aspect. So how do we continue to change the culture? I think it's by sharing kind of our trauma history around that particular aspect. So I think that's by leading by example, I think would be really helpful.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And that's a great idea to have like a symbol of that strength to give to your loved ones. That's wonderful. Our next question is, often care of the dying ends with the death. No more visits are scheduled. How can we try to shift institutions to recognize caregiver grief? For example, the need to follow up with families after a death to care for family and to care for the caregiver.
Whoever wrote that, I want to kiss them. That's probably one of the most difficult questions. Same with myself. After the death, in our charting system, their contact information is wiped out to protect their confidentiality. So now I print all my client lists so that I have access to contact their family members. You're right. Our systems, nurses used to have 2 bereavement calls after the death, and then those have been taken away. We've got to change that system. And there is a group being led by Canadian Hospice, and they've put forward a national strategy on grief. So it went to the government. They were going to wait until after the pandemic. They had it ready to go, but they thought, maybe should we wait? And we said, no, let's do it now. So the government has it, and they're asking for $10 million to create a national strategy for bereavement, which is what is so needed. That's what's going to be helpful. Um, the the Mental Health Commission was given $100 million to create a strategy, and this is what we need to deal with grief, and constantly trying to change, deal with the system. So I know what I do is I do a conference call once a week that previous clients can come in, so that it's an hour of my time that go through work. So usually lasts about an hour and a half. And then I have some kind of contact with them that I can refer to people in groups or stuff like that that can be really helpful. Research says that a third of people grieving benefit from the support of their family and church, a third benefit from one-to-one counseling, and a third benefit from groups. So the more that we can encourage groups to happen, that can be really helpful in dealing with that aspect. You're absolutely right. We still live in this grief denying culture, and the more that we can do, create programs and get programs that are funded are so important in dealing with that aspect.
So that I guess as a follow-up, the next question is, do you support rule breaking or risk taking to change culture?
Yeah, we need to be responsible rebels. I'm constantly challenging the system to say, um, we're seeing the problem that death is the end of the relationship, and it's not. And so we really need to change that. So our West Division of Ontario Health created a to look at the culture that we want to create. And I put my name out there to be a part of it and got on it. So that's going to be my focus, is really focusing on client care. That is going to be expansive, but also, care for ourselves and dealing with the compassion fatigue around that aspect. I do a kind of a we're struggling with the name. It's not a debrief. It's where staff can call in and just talk about um, a client that they're with, and just to get some support. So often it's to celebrate the great care that they did, but then after the death, they're really realizing, wow, I had such an impact on this family. And I'm feeling empty. I'm really missing them. So just supporting their great work around it. It doesn't have to be a problem case that has caused trauma or anything like that. That can be really helpful.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Our next one is along a similar line, looking at long-term care. Some patient advocates have said that they feel that their loved ones are essentially giving up now in COVID whenever they aren't able to see their loved ones as frequently, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. Are you able to speak to that at all? Have you seen that at all? And how do you think that approach should change to support those people?
The sooner that we can get their programs involved. So the one nursing home, long-term care facility I went to, they had 28 deaths. So it was one of the difficult ones. They had staff that didn't take a day off in 4 months. Just did some really incredible, great work. So they organized, drive-by entertainers to come in and do a lot of like that were on the outside of the building. And the sooner they got their programming available, and they did door-to-door stuff. So they were really creative around that particular aspect, which it also highlighted the underfunding of long-term care around that aspect. So that was, I think the more that we can get back to increase program and learn in the second wave that isolation isn't the answer, is that making sure that they're expert on PPE, and making sure that there's 2 or 4 people that can be really supportive in dealing with that particular aspect. I had a real powerful experience at one of the long-term care facilities that taught me a lot about grief. So this long-term care facility, when the person came in, part of the assessment questionnaire was, did you ever have a child die? So I had this rich information. So I went through, there was about 200 residents. I went through all the charts and I identified 12 women that had experienced the death of a child that were cognitively able to participate in a group. So the Friday before Mother's Day, we had this group. I thought, 45 minutes, I don't want to tire them out, and that would be it. 2.5 hours later, we were still having this chat. And so out of the 12, one of the child died from cancer, one from a car accident, and one from a farm accident. The other 9 died from pneumonia. The average age of this group was 96. And back then, they didn't have antibiotics to deal with pneumonia. So if their child was weak, they would die. So the one that was the eldest, I think she was 98, she just stopped and she said, I have a daughter in 72 years. This is going to be the best Mother's Day ever. Very much still part of our culture. Don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. And it helped me realize we just don't grieve in the present moment. We grieve in the past and in the future. And so that's where our bereavement programs need to kind of focus in. And they're really gaining more. The more that we can train our volunteers to become expert. In victim services, they're called crisis responders. And they do some great work. And it's just kind of that peer support. So I think there's a huge role of providing some really good care with a variety of programs.
Thank you so much. And I agree. I think it's going to be interesting to see how they try to prioritize that as we come into the second wave. And hopefully it'll prevent some secondary trauma later on.
Yeah, Quebec, they just didn't need a few, they just did not need a few PSWs. They needed 10,000. And what they did is they just raised the salary to 26,000 a year, full benefits, a pension, an appropriate mileage, and a training program, and they got the 10,000. They're in really good shape. I really like what our politicians have been doing pretty well all across Canada. They've really responded, and our directors of public health, I've been so impressed. And I think in Ontario, we focused a little too much on hospitals. No, we focused the right attention on hospitals, but we forgot about long-term care. So now I think that would be helpful. But, our program for PSWs isn't as robust. They're boosting up the salary, but only for recent grads. We got 10 years of grads that couldn't make it and got out of the profession. We've got them already trained, but just give them an adequate salary. Our PSWs get 20 cents a kilometer. I get 40. We got to change that particular system.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah. And I think that that's a great response that Quebec had, and hopefully we don't turn back to just shutting everything down, because that obviously wasn't the answer.
So I encourage everybody to be responsible rebels and keep on changing the system. If you go to the Canadian Hospice website, it's about a 50-page document on the grief initiative, and it's getting its way up in the political and Health Canada. So it's going to take a while, but we've started.
That's great news. We have another question, more so around learners. So what would you suggest as a first step for learners who have not come to deal with any death in their lives before medical school, in coming into this part of practice in a healthy way? And do you know of any specific tools for them?
Yeah. So what I'll do is I got a number of them. I'll put a list together and send it to Sarah and send it out. There's a couple that are really good. That companioning model by Alan Wolfont is just a really good model and I learned so much about that. But I'll send some resources. That's a good question.
Excellent. Thanks so much. we have two more on my list right now. You mentioned about leaning in, but how you are finding it more difficult to be engaged in your virtual, I guess, consultations or interactions. Do you have any advice for adjusting your approach aside from, just talking more and everything and being more present virtually? Because we will be seeing patients more so that way.
So what I found after 2 weeks of doing this with the phone, I don't like doing this. And because that's what I do with my family. I put the phone to my ear. I never have it on speakerphone. And so I found I could be a little more focused if I had a headset on. I have a little stand that I put the phone in, but the headset was helpful on phone interviews. So that allowed me to be a little more focused and to make sure that I'm not putting in a load of laundry or doing dishes while I'm talking, that I've got, I usually have a set of questions or focuses that I want to do. And therefore, that's what keeps me focused, because it's so easy to get distracted without having a person in front of me periodically saying, am I on the right page here? Am I going in the right direction with you? So before I would be able to tell cues around that would be really helpful. And really coming clean if I don't understand or were important. I remember once it was a bereaved mom. It was a point when therapy was really important, and she was coming in at 3:00. She was my last appointment, and I felt really nauseous. I was gravel naive, but I thought I really don't want to cancel. So I just took a Gravol, and I didn't even realize it, but my head snapped during the appointment, and I didn't think she caught it. So I didn't say anything till the next session. I came clean. I said, I really should have canceled. I was really feeling nauseous. I took a Gravol and I was so sleepy. And she goes, thank God you said that, because I saw your head snap and I thought, my death of my child is that insignificant that it's making you fall asleep? Oh, I'm so glad I came clean. So I do that in my phone interviews. I come clean to say, wait a minute, I got distracted for a minute. Can you go back? Because it's so much easier to get distracted on the phone than when it.
Thank you so much. That's great advice, and staying more present. And I know I find myself sometimes guilty of attempting to multitask, but with those kinds of interactions, you can't do that. Our next one is going back to the discussion around long-term care and PSWs. If there are a lot of new PSWs in long-term care, they will need support as part of the team. It'll be a hard time to start a new job during the pandemic. Do you have any suggestions for supporting those new team members?
Yes, eat as a group. The power of the group will be really helpful of how I coped. How did you cope? What are important in dealing with that aspect? In the pandemic, I worked with one family, and I went into the ICU with them. So I was there 3 hours, and so I was, glove, gown, face mask, the whole bit for 3 hours. I was exhausted because my glasses were fogging up. I'm looking over my glasses, so I had eye strain. I had a bit of headache. I was hot. I was, and I thought, that's 3 hours. That's not a 12-hour shift. So just the physical demands of the PPE is exhausting, let alone the rational fear around that aspect. So I would say in long-term care, make sure it's paid. At the end of our shifts, we're going to kind of double up a bit so that we can do a bit of a daily, what did you learn and what would be helpful? I think that would be really important. The first 2 weeks, I didn't even realize it. I drove around with a thermometer in my pocket. I would be, after a home visit, I'd be driving the car and I'd see a thermometer under my tongue. I was taking my temperature. There's this irrational fear that I just had to be, really hyper vigilant, which was ridiculous. I never take my temperature. It just shows how that fear can be so strong in dealing with that aspect.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think that's a great suggestion to make it a routine aspect of the day as new, healthcare providers instead of something that just needs to be done when it's necessary. We do have another question. Our new Dean and CEO at NOSM, Dr. Sarita Verma, she's spoken a lot about kindness, compassion, and resilience across our campus in Northern Ontario specifically. Do you have anything to say to her?
Yes. So look, what we know, sympathy is I see somebody hurt. Empathy is I see somebody hurt and I'm called to do something about it. But compassion is totally different. I see that you hurt. Um, I'm called to do something about it and I actually do something. So compassionate care is so important in dealing with that aspect. And I think if we can connect it to our woundedness, that's what really allows us to provide that little extra type of care because it's focused on our past experience, especially if we've done our work. That's why I love that question about which new medical students do. Your first two deaths are going to tell you how you handle death in the future. So that's where that loss history graph is really important around that. So kindness, having that kind of gratitude, and that's where with kindness, that whole thing about dysfunctional individuals or families, it's their function. Taking people where they're at is so important in dealing with that particular aspect. So that would be crucial is I see that you hurt. I'm called. I feel moved by it. And now I'm going to do something about it.
Thank you so much. That's a great, I hadn't heard that, definition of compassion before, but it's perfectly encompasses what we need to bring forward to our clients. And one last question that I have is that many aspects I find of grief are kind of more measurable, but with COVID, we've lost that measure of time. So how would you approach the lack of awareness in our timeline of someone who's struggling with the everyday losses during the pandemic? So not just deaths, but loss of birthdays and things like that.
That's an excellent question. I had, I've been so fortunate. I still got a paycheck. The people that have lost employment, lost businesses, or may lose business, the decision, do I stay in business? Do I wait it out? All those things, the parents that have had to double team and triple team, school and all that aspects are there's incredible amounts of losses. So I think breaking them down into small chunks and then that's where that when you do the loss history graph, what also people do is the longer the line up, the more significant loss. But on the other side, going down, what allowed you to stay present to your pain and suffering? So good support, good family support. And so it balances off that particular loss. So I think mainly just being aware of where we're at with our losses, and then just connecting with someone you trust to bounce it off. These are some of the losses I'm experiencing, or this is where I'm kind of feeling dead on some of those other losses that are important. So just mentorship. I think that's the other thing. I think nursing has done fantastic about mentorship, the nursing profession. And I think we need to learn from that we need to find mentors. Can you mentor me during this pandemic is very helpful, but then also offering, I think that is so crucial in dealing with that. It's different than leadership, than supervision. Mentorship is you're able to get in the muck with them. That can be really helpful.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think that was that really spoke to me as a medical student, in that I'm headed into a bit of a scary time to enter the medical profession. But having somebody, with me and acknowledging that will hopefully lessen that, but also acknowledge that it's going to be a long journey to get out of COVID, I hope. that was our last question for today. So I just wanted to thank you so much for your time and for what such wonderful stories and sharing. And I learned so much from that. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. And I'm in Bayfield on my own, so please feel free to email or call. I'll take calls too if you have a particular question. It'll break up the boredom.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody. And I'm just going to share my screen briefly with everybody just to remind you of our palliative care website where you can go to complete your evaluation. And also obtain your certificate of attendance through these two links right here. And I hope that you will join us for our next session, which is scheduled for Thursday, November 26th, and will be on advanced care planning and serious illness conversations. You can register for that through the website as well on our registration page. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great day.